second. Okay. All right. Okay, we should be good then. Excellent. Good evening and welcome to the New York Studio School's virtual evening lecture series. Tonight is my great pleasure to be introducing Katy Siegel and Sarah Roberts presenting Joan Mitchell, the Making of a Retrospective. I would like to just personally thank Sarah and Katy for taking the time to join us tonight. And I would like to thank everyone in the audience as well. We've been looking forward to this talk for quite a long time. And I would also just like to take a moment and say that the New York Studio School Evening Lecture Series is generously supported by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, the Robert Lehman Foundation, and many individual contributors. And I would like to thank all of those individual contributors because without your help, this programming would not be possible and keeping it free and open to all. So thank you. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to just point out the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will leave time for questions after the presentation, but do feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. And it's a little easier to field in that as opposed to the comments. So I just encourage the Q&A. And thanks again. Like I said, tonight we've been looking forward to tonight for quite a long time, and so it's very exciting to have this presentation. And our speakers tonight, Sarah Roberts serves as Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Curator and Head of Painting and Sculpture at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She was the primary author and editor of the Rauschenberg Research Project, SFMOMA's first scholarly digital publication, and organized the museum's 2017 presentation of the Rauschenberg Retrospective. Recent exhibitions include Carol Bove and John Chamberlain, Converse, Louise Bourgeois Spiders, and of course tonight's topic, the major retrospective Joan Mitchell, co-organized with our second speaker, Katy Siegel from the Baltimore Museum of Art. The exhibition was in San Francisco from September of last year to January of this year. And now the exhibition is in Baltimore, and which leads us to Katy Siegel, who is the Thaw Chair at Stony Brook University and Senior Curator of Research at the Baltimore Museum of Art. Exhibitions include Odyssey, Jack Whitten sculpture from 1963 to 2017 with Kelly Baum, Mark Bradford's presentation at the Venice Biennale with Christopher Bedford, Postwar Art Between the Pacific and the Atlantic from 1945 to 1965 with Okwui, Enwezor, and Ulrich Wilmes at the Haus to Kunst in Munich, and again, the Joan Mitchell retrospective, which is now in Baltimore. The exhibition opened on March 6th and is open until August 14th, and I hope that if you haven't seen it, you have a chance to see it. And I'll just give a plug to this very beautiful catalog, which is in the New York Studio School's library. And again, we're just so excited to have this with Joan's connection to the New York Studio School and some alumni such as Joyce Pinsato and Carl Plansky. So without further ado, Sarah Roberts and Katy Siegel.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sam, and thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight and to the New York Studio School for inviting us to speak to you. We are going to start tonight with just talking about how we approached the exhibition and some of the primary questions that we started out with and how our answers and even the questions themselves changed over time as we got into the research and getting to know the work in greater depth. Then we're going to talk a bit about the research process and the process of putting the show together, which took a little over 4 years, and how that research led us to organizing the show the way that we did, which is around major cycles of her work. And then we're going to turn to some of those major cycles and talk about the work in a little bit greater depth, and some of the themes that we chose to emphasize that distinguish our projects from others. So we'll jump right in. And Katy, over to you. You're on mute, Katy.
I still can't do that after all this time. But let me. Are you seeing the?
It's right now.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Sam, for having us and for everyone for coming. Inevitably, one of the first things that comes up when you mentioned Joan Mitchell was the idea that she was a woman artist in New York in the 1950s that has not received her due. And that's, a very commonplace idea today. And it's the subject of Mary Gabriel's very wonderful and well-researched book, as well as PBS shows, documentaries, a lot of articles. It was a commonplace idea today. It was just getting started in 2017 and is very much grounded in the idea of a second generation of undervalued artists who are seen in relationship to one another. So Mitchell has always talked about with Frankenthaler and Hartigan, which is still true today. And there have been a series of irritating reviews and asides, mostly by male critics, if I can say that, who through the recent retrospectives for Lee Krasner, the many shows for Helen Frankenthaler, are always saying, who was the greatest woman artist among the three, sort of comparing and relating them together. But we started very much in that place. As we did the research, and as Sarah said, it took 4 or 5 years, and it was a very, very deep dive. We started with the question, which I always start a project with, what does it mean to do this artist justice? And since Joan Mitchell wasn't overlooked, as much as she just sort of brushed aside. She had never gotten the serious, very, very in-depth research, kind of attention that's given to someone like Willem de Kooning. So as we began to do this deep research dive for Mitchell, we began to rethink how her identity as a woman artist was not entirely generalizable to some idea of the woman artist in the 1950s. So first of all, Mitchell lived until 1992. And second of all, during many periods of her life, she engaged intensely with questions about the roles for women and for artists. This was most true in the mid-1970s, when changes and questions about the art world raised by feminism had a strong impact on her. And this happened in the mid-70s, around the same time, the first Whitney Biennial in 1973, where Mitchell showed alongside a younger generation of artists that include Elizabeth Murray, Louise Fishman, late and lamented, Joan Snyder. And at the same time, her work is featured in the Women Choose Women show at the New York Cultural Center. The next year, her solo show opened at the Whitney, was seen as a revelation, especially by younger artists. She appeared in the Feminist Art Journal. She subscribed to feminist magazines, and Kate Horsfeld and Lynn Blumenthal interviewed her that year as part of a project focusing on under-recognized women artists. So a kind of revival of painting and the impact of feminism were interweaving. At the same time, around 1975, she started seeing feminist historian Linda Nochlin, who traveled regularly to France for her work on the 19th century, but was also connecting to living artists. Nochlin visited Vitoy, and here you see around 1976 in the terrace at Vitoy on the left. And at the right, you see Nochlin's address book and an entry that describes directions to train time, how to get to the blue metal door at Vitoy Avenue Claude Monet, which was Mitchell's address. And this is happening all amidst the enormous attention that Nochlin and Anne Sutherland Harris are receiving for their traveling exhibition, Women Artists 1550 to 1950. And she and Mitchell spoke at length about the issues. And here I just want to pause and say, thanks to the Joan Mitchell Foundation, which provided the image on the left and about 90% of all of the material you're going to see today. So we visited many archives, like the Archive of American Art, but the Joan Mitchell Foundation was extraordinarily supportive in regards to research. So during the mid-70s especially, Mitchell saw herself as a weed or a mauvaise herbe. It sounds better in French always. To her, dandelions were weeds, but so were sunflowers and daisies, any plant, large or small, that was taken for granted or seen as unruly, out of place, according to imposed classifications, or maybe was beautiful only when seen with the right eyes. So she felt this especially strongly as a woman, I think, and she asks us to rethink the most entrenched qualities that are the criteria for what we value and what we take to indicate greatness. So we became more and more interested in how Mitchell expanded the possibilities for 20th century painting. Not just that she was a woman just as good as the men, according to the same criteria, but she made us think not just about the limits of being a woman artist, but the expansive possibilities of being a woman and a painter.
So one of the other major framing questions that we took into the project was thinking about Mitchell's national identity, how to characterize her and think about her reception both in the US and in France because of the way that she, her transnational kind of life that she lived. She, of course, was born in Chicago, and after graduating from the Art Institute of Chicago, she was in New York for about a year, then went to France for a little over a year, then was back in New York in 1950. And in those first couple of years in New York City, she really established herself quite quickly. She gained the recognition of her peers, of critics, of collectors, and by 1956 or 57 is appearing in national press, as you can see in these two images here. In that time frame, she really cemented her association with the New York School and with abstract expressionist painting. And it's a framing that has stuck to subsequent interpretations of her work in the United States to kind of a baffling degree. In spite of the fact that she began traveling back and forth to France for extended periods in 1955 and then left the US permanently in 1959, US publication scholarship, the view here has been so stuck in 1950s New York framings that the decades of work that she made in France after the 50s just haven't been grappled with in as much depth. They're seen as less interesting or just an extension of what she started in the 50s, but mainly there hasn't been a very considered reckoning of those decades. The view of her work in France is completely different. They know and value the work from the 70s and later, and they see her really as a landscape painter with deep roots in 19th century French painting traditions. So neither of these views is full or accurate. They both have a lot of truth to them, but neither really takes stock of the ins and outs of the whole career or grapples with through lines or how she continually challenged herself from the 1940s to the 1990s. So we really wanted to get her unmoored from the 50s to think transnationally about what it meant, what kind of work she was doing in the US and in France. And then also to think about how that strategy might shift, not just how Mitchell has been seen, but again, how 1950s New York painting has been understood. One discovery in the course of research was the extent to which she struggled herself with a lifelong feeling of being unmoored or unsettled in either place. So it comes up in lots of letters. I'm just going to quote one to give you an example. This is a letter from France to a friend in New York that she wrote in 1971. She says, quote, "I guess I'm leaving Riepel," who was her partner at the time, "and don't necessarily want to live there, the USA. What to do and how to do it and how to continue painting and where. I could never paint again, for example, on St. Mark's Place. I guess my problem will always be some sort of transient existence, living out of a valise." And this nature of hers, this kind of transient character, was something that was noted by friends, and even in early reviews, Dory Ashton said that Mitchell struck her as a woman in transit. This restlessness, this feeling of never being settled, always looking, always reconsidering, looking at other options. We started to think about this aspect of her nature, this perspective and way of living, and about how it might have impacted how she worked and how she thought about abstract painting. We can go on to the next slide. Important to note also that the transnational nature of her life was not just a binary US and France. Particularly in the 1960s, she traveled constantly all around Europe, as you can see from this little snapshot of places she visited in the 1960s. And this idea of circulation and circulation away from traditional centers really has become an important subject in post-war studies. It's a way of decentering art, looking at circulation habits rather than, the kind of the major urban centers and areas of traditional focus. Mitchell's personal travel coincided with her first group exhibitions in Europe, so her work is circulating just as she is. And there are some interesting ways that she's framed in various group exhibitions that we also started to trace and consider. So for example, she's in the 1958 Venice Biennale as an American artist, and she's talked about and cast as kind of foreign in the European context in that show. And then just the next year, she's in the Paris Biennale and with the French artists. She's placed with the French painters. So a really curious juxtaposition in just 2 years. Also of note, her social circles in Europe were quite transnational. There were people coming from to spend time with her, to stay with her from all over Europe, the US, China, cycle through all these various cities and countries around Europe. So through her travels, but also through literature and music, she was connected to ideas of grand culture in many ways, and in ways that not a lot of American artists were at that time. It was a kind of new grand tour with an emphasis on cosmopolitanism and thinking about across intellectual and cultural history. And she shared that really more with literary figures, people like Frank O'Hara and Edwin Denby, than she did with other artists.
I think the biggest overall subject we really were wrestling with from the very beginning was the question of biography and art and how they go together or don't go together. And particularly, again, for a woman artist, the common and accurate critique, especially for people, scholars of my generation and Sarah's generation, that women, like Black artists, like queer artists, the biography is overemphasized and the achievements as an artist are underemphasized. So we thought a lot about how to negotiate the relationship between these two things. Sarah,
I think over the course of the research, it just became quite clear that there were these very visible in the work intersections between her art and her life, particular places, particular landscapes that she was thinking about and reaching for, and what she was putting down on canvas. And that her life really was the center of her art in many ways, and that she had she made art the center of her life, and her everyday experiences of the physical world, of friends, lovers, place, music, they all find their way into the painting. And so that was kind of our guiding, our guidelines going into writing the book and thinking about the exhibition choices, was to think about and emphasize how it comes through in the painting. Where does the life show up in the painting, and to use the work as the way to talk about the life.
Yeah, and I just want to underline that idea of not only art with life at the center, which I think opens up this abstraction to a much broader audience, and really is part of that rethinking of mid-century painting that Sarah, you mentioned earlier, but also life with art at the center, that it's not a choice that many women could or did make at mid-century, but the ability through family money, through discipline, through good fortune and privilege, and also strong will, she went to the studio every day. She made art the center of her life, and that discipline and skill really comes through. I think it's also important to note that we had a research team of 7 young women who were curators, scholars at the 2 museums, and at my university, a fellow from the Joan Mitchell Foundation. And they didn't grow up, they're 2 generations younger than Sarah and myself, and they didn't grow up with that bias against biography as a historical tool and narrative. And I think that was really influential for us in our thinking too.
So turning now to the research process, you're probably wondering what you're looking at. We started in, I think in late 2017. And as Katy said, we were really fortunate to have an extraordinary research team. And the success of this project really rests with that group of 7 individuals. But we started traveling quite extensively around the US, across France, the UK, Switzerland, to see works in public and private collections. Of course, we can't show you works in people's homes or storage areas in museums or facilities, but this is a picture of the Swiss Freeport building, very James Bond type experience to go visit a place like this. But we became committed very early in the process to seeing as many works as we possibly could in person, because it was clear that that was essential to really understanding how she was working her way in and out of bodies of work, but also because the works really don't photograph well. And there were many works that had not been photographed at all, but also works that you just couldn't tell. And we would see an image of it and think it looked great and go see it in person. And it was, not as exciting. And then the opposite, a work that didn't really shine on paper, we'd go see in person, was truly extraordinary. So I think we can go to the next slide. I think
Sarah said we couldn't show you this, but we're showing it to you, so.
Yeah, well, it's discreet. So here are some works that we saw in storage areas, auction houses propped up on the floor, people's dining rooms, every possible setting. Collectors really love living with these works. Most were very generous in opening their homes and letting us come see things. We had to have a lot of negotiating, wheedling, begging, pleading conversations over the course of the years, planning the loans to convince people to let us have things for, up to 2 years for many of them. And, we saw things in major museums. We saw things in a lot of regional museums where a lot of Mitchell's works have ended up across the US. Unlike a lot of artists from her generation, there's not great depth in many US collections. The National Gallery and the Museum of Modern Art and SFMOMA have concentrations of her work, but even then, not as what you would see for a lot of other artists. We also saw a lot of works in auction houses. Interestingly, as soon as we announced the show, lots of work started popping up at auction. Not a huge surprise, but always a great way to see works, and our auction house colleagues helped us track down works that had been sold previously as well. And we can go on to the next slide.
I think it's worth mentioning that the market is always a part of the story that people focus on, and we don't always love that or talking about that, as grateful as we are to the auction houses, but it is one way that people measure worth and success in a capitalist culture. So it's certainly a measure of the rising esteem, Mitchell is held in.
Yes, a huge
Yes, yeah, for sure. So along with this 500, 600 painting adventure that we were on, we were also going through archives, and Joan Mitchell Foundation, like we said, gave us unprecedented access. It was the first retrospective that's been done with a proper formal archive and archivist in place at the foundation, and we're so grateful to Laura Morris and to the rest of the foundation. We also, through a surviving niece, had access to family photo albums and collections of letters. And we saw a different side of her, that biographical side of daughter, sister, aunt, but also the extent to which art drove her everyday life. Every kind of decision she made was about, how it would or wouldn't support her artistic practice. We also went to artists, many of the younger artists you'll hear about later, who shared letters that they'd kept as keepsakes from Joan, and we did many oral histories with the seven-person team, as well as archival research in US and French institutions. The letters were windows into her head while she was working, her frame of mind and who she was looking at.
Just an example, and I'm sure this is hard to see on your little computer screens, but the research team logged meticulously any references as we were going through letters to books she was reading, music she was listening to, films that she was seeing, because she talked about those things quite actively, and it really gave us a sense of what was informing her, what was in her head as she was moving into and out of each body of work. And it really informed a lot of the writing that we did about each cycle as well.
So along with these deep dives into Mitchell research, on our own with the team, we held 2 convenings, which were generously funded by the Terra Foundation and by the Thaw chair at Stony Brook. So we had a convening in New York at the Guggenheim, which was partly closed and partly public, and again in Paris, where and this is an image from the Paris convening at the Fondation Louis Vuitton, which has an extensive collection of Mitchell. We looked at works in person and met with colleagues who are scholars, curators, artists were very helpful, conservators. And one of the things about constructing a monograph is understanding also what the context is for that artist and how you draw that contextual field. How much like and how much different is she from her peers? Who are her peers? Is it that very limited New York City women in the 50s? If you try to broaden the context, what and who gets included? What information do we need to understand any artist as a social and historical being? For Mitchell in particular, I think because of her long career and her personal sensitivity, there are clear moments when she's synchronized with what's going on in touch and in dialogue with what's going on in painting and the art world, and moments where she feels very unsynchronized with the dominant moment, both out of fashion, which is painful, but then also deliberately independent. So many thanks to the scholars who helped us understand the broader context and questions involved. So we arrived at the idea that the basic idea that Mitchell worked in cycles of 3 to 4 years when she would explore pictorial ideas, palettes, landscapes, memories, visual thinking. And we're going to show a few of them to you today. We wanted to explore the work in the way that Mitchell herself experienced it. And so, I think this is, to give us credit, I think this is the least monotonous abstract painting show I can imagine. You're looking from paintings from 3 different cycles here, and she's moving very quickly, all from the 1960s, moving very quickly between ideas. She's against the idea of a signature style that was so typical in the among artists and critics in the 1950s in that original context. And you can see her moving and moving every 3 to 4 years throughout her life, through almost 5 decades, with an enormous energy and openness to the world. Sarah, did you want to chime in?
I'm having some technical difficulties, actually, so maybe why don't we go on to the next slide, and then I'll jump in.
Okay. So she's changing constantly. She's also returning. So we're gonna look at briefly at 5 different moments in her work. The first one is that moment that Sarah already touched on when she's moving between New York and Paris between 1955 and 1959. We spent a lot of time looking at this work in person and studying letters and tickets and receipts and records, photographs, trying to figure out what was painted where, because she's moving constantly, not only between New York and Paris several times a year, as well as Chicago and California to see friends. But one year within Paris, she moved 5 times to 5 different studios. People are exchanging studios and subletting studios and squatting in each other's studios. So there's a lot of movement. And she's also spending time in St. Mark's Place. This photo we found was taken by Sam Francis, who was a close friend of Jean-Paul Riopelle, who was one of the first people she met. And she became lovers with Riopelle and was quite close to him and to Francis. And it shows a painting that's not unlike Hudson River Dayline, a very well-known work that we tracked to a private collection. Mitchell, as you see her, she was rolling and unrolling these canvases, sometimes wet. And you can often see that by squashed impasto in the paintings of the 1950s. She's struggling with different paint materials. She's very sensitive to what the production and the composition is of any individual painting line that she's working with. But despite her mobility in those years, her rapid change in movement, you could see the coalescing of a set of interests in the mid 1950s, like in this set of works. We've just sort of selected at random from those years that are included in the exhibition. She's developing not a signature style, but a language of a landscape orientation, often in horizontal works. She's often delimiting edges of the top and bottom, which sometimes relate to sky and sea. She's developing her mark, which is quite declarative and strong, often has the response a counter mark. She'll make a blue and then she'll paint over it with red or cross it out to make a kind of X. And you can see the beginnings of things like in the lower left-hand corner, the bridge. The bridge was not only a thematic that preoccupied her throughout her life, a memory, but also here takes the form of a diptych, which is a form that she would work with increasingly. Just quickly, these are some familiar kinds of images from 1950s New York, and you can see they're both from Stable Gallery. You see Mitchell in the center at a group show opening, facing towards the camera on the left, and on the right, two images from contact sheets, from a film strip contact sheet of photographs of her stable opening from 1957 in a crowded scene. It always sounds like a lot of fun when we look back at it, and we are often nostalgic for it, but it often felt like a fishbowl to Mitchell, and she felt like the fish, with competitive people watching her every turn, watching her every move. She did love a lot of people in that scene. However, you see Frank O'Hara on the right in profile, and O'Hara and his poetry, like poetry in general, would be important to Mitchell throughout her life. This is one of the several paintings she made for Frank O'Hara after his painting, his poem To the Harbor Master. She says, the poem says, "I wanted to be sure to reach you. Though my ship was on the way, it got caught in some moorings. I'm always tying up and then deciding to depart." It really speaks to the feeling of the harbor, the feeling of mobility and travel, the landscape, but the feeling of always missing someone, always leaving someone behind, never quite in the right place at the right time.
I hope everybody can hear me all right. I'm having a little bit of shaky internet, but it seems to have stabilized. So jumping ahead a little bit, the next cycle of works we're going to look at comes out of a period where she's traveling by boat, sailing. Jean-Paul Riopelle had a sailboat, and they kept it moored in the south of France and spent weeks and sometimes months at a time based out of a village on the Côte d'Azur and going for sails for the day, for 2 days, 3 days, few weeks around the Mediterranean. And it was a very lively social scene down in that part of France, and a kind of interesting period of time for her. Out on the water, is very athletic, kind of adventurous. They're fantastic letters writing about how stormy it could get and how frightening. And maybe we can go on to the next slide. The body of work that comes together here is really the first time that we see her bringing in the specifics of a very particular landscape, responding to the visual vocabulary of the place. So this is a view from Riopelle's home movies of the fort town of Girolata on the island of Corsica, which was a frequent destination for them. And you can see these very distinctive limestone cliffs with these kind of scrubby brush vegetation growing on the rocks. And she told a story from this time over and over again about having seen a very particular cypress tree illuminated in bright sunlight against a stucco wall, kind of classic south of France visual. And then said that it would just really stayed with her, and she made a whole cycle of paintings about the cypress tree and on the subject of these trees. So it's again, completely abstract, but it's not a big leap, I think, to get from those limestone cliffs, and those silhouetted windswept trees and shrubs to a painting like that on the right called Blue Tree, which is in the collection of the Worcester Art Museum. She's cycling through this dark central mass surrounded by a white or a gray or kind of neutral background over and over again in different formats. We can go to the next slide, please. Different formats in painting, but also in drawings, very beautiful charcoal drawings from this time frame, again, taking up this subject of the cypress. This is also when she really starts getting involved with multiple panel painting. So Katy mentioned the bridge, that very first diptych. This is one of the first triptychs. There was a break in the late 50s, and then around 1963, she starts investigating multiple panel paintings in depth and in earnest. And for her, it was a format she would use extensively, but in lots of different ways for the rest of her career. It was a way of breaking up a wide horizontal, of suggesting different views or vignettes of a single place. It was also could be a way to enable a panoramic or a sequential type of looking. Here in Girolata Triptych, it's almost a altarpiece format. You've got this sort of central image with the two side panels. So in the midst of this very physical experience of this expansive landscape, being out on the water in the middle of the ocean, she starts thinking about how to frame the view, in a sense, how to use the multiple panels as a way of thinking about different forms of address, how one stands in front of a view or a particular landscape, how one experiences a place, anything from kind of an enveloping experience of a landscape, almost a sublime type experience, to the more focused and intimate type of looking that we will see her investigate with later painting cycles.
That idea of a view was so important to Mitchell throughout her career. It's probably the strongest constant throughout her life. And she and Riopelle are traveling throughout the south of France, throughout the Mediterranean, and they decide that they want a permanent country place, partly because her mother dies and she now has the money to buy something substantial, and partly because they're feeling more and more sort of old hat, irrelevant in Paris as that post-war Paris world ends, with Giacometti and the other people they were friends with giving way to a younger generation of artists, the Nouveau Realistes, different kinds of politics, and they're looking for a sort of escape. So in 1967, Mitchell purchased a property in the countryside outside Paris in the village of Vittoy. And she would spend weekends there, moving permanently at the end of 1968. So you see the view from the terrace on the right, a view that would figure largely in her paintings over the next 3 decades. And on the left, you see Riopelle kind of acting like a goofball along with Mitchell, Betsy Jolas, the important composer, Shirley Jaffe, the painter, longtime friend, as well as Ed Clark, the painter, and his wife, Hetty Clark. And Ed Clark said of Vittoy, I think this is the best summer, he said, I've never seen a place so goddamn beautiful. And Mitchell invited Ed Clark and Hetty Clark to live in Vittoy full time. She met them at a cafe in Paris and could see that he was what she called a real painter, which was a very important idea for her. And she would come on the weekends with Riopelle and Riopelle's daughters and invite lots of friends, Betsy Jolas and her husband, Shirley Jaffe. And Mitchell would draw in these beautiful sketchbooks seen here in a case from the exhibition, and using colored pencil and marker and new kind of materials, which deserve a lot of further study. We don't know a lot about them, and whether some of these materials were things that the young Riopelle girls were bringing with them, or if it's something that artists started to use more. It opened up her color palette, together with the incredibly ravishing colors of the French countryside. The tools she had gave her new colors. And in paintings, she would go back to Paris to paint, and then she took over the painting studio at the end of 1968. And paintings like My Landscape 2 that you see here on the right, come out of the sketches, they come out of the beauty of the countryside, and as well as her increasing independence from art world fashion and her feeling of freedom in connecting to nature, more and more seen as representational and identifiable landscapes, and her connection to pure beauty and joy, which felt very much at a distance from pop art and conceptual art, minimalism, to Mitchell, like many of her generation. You see Sans Neige, which continues what Sarah was talking about with Girolata, the triptych form here, reference to the fields of flowers around Vittoy, a kind of brilliant color that maybe connects to Matisse, among others. And that's also, the title is a little bit of a joke about Monet, who had once lived in a cottage that was on Mitchell's property or adjacent to Mitchell's property at a later point, and where her gardener and housekeeper still lived. She lived on the Avenue Claude Monet, and people teased her all the time about the Monet connection. Monet had painted a very famous series of Vitoy during an enormous French snowstorm. And she calls this one Sans Neige, or Without Snow, to sort of poke fun at that connection. A guard at Baltimore told me he felt like when he walked in this room, which is very much indoors with no natural light, that he felt like he was walking into the outdoors and in a room of brilliant sun.
The question, or the connection to 19th century French painting really comes to the fore in this period, or late 1960s. And as Katy said, people began to sort of say to her, "Oh, you're the next Monet, you're living in Vitoy," and she really chafed at that association. And for the rest of her life, I think, kind of was rankled by the idea that she was, taking after Monet or trying to do what Monet did. She had professed, real interest, particularly in late Monet paintings in earlier interviews, but around this time, she sort of turned against Monet. She was always much more comfortable with Van Gogh and the association with Van Gogh. She identified him as her favorite painter when she was 9 years old, going through the galleries at the Art Institute of Chicago. And throughout her life, she was drawn to his work for many reasons. The intensity of it, the saturated color, his very direct love for nature, and the way that comes through. This is just a postcard of a painting that's at the museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a postcard that Mitchell had tacked up on her, kind of pinboard in her studio. With both Monet and Van Gogh, there's this intense observation and absorption of nature that I think resonated with her. And she begins this cycle of sunflower paintings that are very directly turning towards Monet and one of his most well-known subjects in this group of paintings from 1969. Thinking, turning from that more panoramic type landscape experience to more specific elements of the garden, which is where the next cycle of work would then go.
And I would say that she lived in Vitoy for the rest of her life, and the enormous formal gardens, the forest around Vitoy, the grounds were an inexhaustible source of inspiration to her.
Just an incredibly beautiful landscape. But as with the sunflowers, the next group that comes out takes a more intimate and focused view on landscape. She picks up a completely different brush mark, this very vertical focused, maybe using an 1.5 inch, 2 inch wide brush, a mark that some critics called a paw mark, because it's very much, like this vertical scratch with the brush. She really worked through painting after painting using this same type of mark. And this is a group of works that were shown together in her exhibition at Fort Cod in 1976. And it's just a demonstration of how she worked in this theme and variation type of habit, and the variety that could come out of that way of working. She very often worked towards an exhibition, so it was a great tool for us to look at what was shown together in each exhibition. That often provides kind of the structure for looking at the bodies of work. But of course, there were many, many, many works that followed the same method or theme, but that weren't included in the exhibitions that we explored as well. This is one of the tighter cycles, though, I think, from her entire body of work.
Yeah, agreed. And we had one of the many surprises and revelations of the research was how much she was involved with the studio school in these years in the mid 1970s. And thanks to Sam and the school for letting us dig through your records and helping us excavate. Mitchell began teaching at the Paris sessions of the studio school in the mid 70s at the invitation of Elaine de Kooning, her old friend. And you see Elaine and Joan here. They're outside Giverny. They're pointing to a plaque about Claude Monet, another little Monet poke. And so she taught in Paris for years, and also made frequent visits to studios in New York. And so this is, again, a period of where Mitchell is reconnecting to the world. Painting is coming back into fashion, as well as the art world taking another look at women artists. And you see a letter to for Cod written on the left for that, about the dinner for that show that Sarah was just talking about. And she's saying, she's telling him who to invite. And she says, the 3 lady painters and I am inviting are extremely talented, not Arviste and not too downtown for Pierre Matisse, no vulgarity. I'm actually the only possibility for acting up or saying those 4-letter words. So keep me at the end of the table. But I'll try real hard to be charming. Love to see Anna Lee Newman, Elaine de Kooning, if you want. We're great friends. So she's connecting to older women who are friends, and also to younger women like Phyllis Haley, Carol Engelson, and Hollis Jeffcoat from the studio school, as well as Cora Cohen, Elizabeth Clay, Emily Cheng, so many women who were young women who were being mentored by Mitchell and were helpful to us. And at the same time, she's looking back into history. And on the right, you see a postcard from the Van Gogh Museum, which is sent to her by Phyllis and Hollis. And they're thanking her, Mitchell, for sponsoring a trip for them to see the Van Goghs. And they're calling her Rose as a reference to Rosa Bonheur. And so there's a lot of talk about Mitchell as a kind of Rosa Bonheur figure, or as Jean-Paul says, Jean-Paul calls me Rosa Mellor. And she's thinking about all of these things together while she's seeing Nochlin, talking to Nochlin about her show, which featured the Horse Fair by Rosa Bonheur, and it's all bundled together. I think the most significant artist in a lot of ways in the story is Joyce Penzato. Maybe significant in the sense that she spent the most time at Vitoy and looms large in the catalog. Joyce opened her studio door one day at the New York Studio School, and there in a fur coat was Joan Mitchell, looking like Lauren Bacall. They did a studio visit, and Joan took her to a bar where Joyce drank 6 martinis and was too scared to order any food and just promptly keeled over and passed out. And for the rest of the time she knew her, she called her 6 martinis Joyce. Penzato called Mitchell in turn her art mother. And even though they fought like cats and dogs when Joyce spent long periods of time at Vitoy, she was always grateful to her. And she also helped clean up the St. Mark's studio when Mitchell lost the lease. And there's Joyce, who helped us so much with the research with a turpentine can and a paint tube from Mitchell, which I treasure. And she's has a wonderful essay in the catalog. Sarah, I'm going to skip ahead to the last.
Okay.
To make sure we have questions.
Yeah, for sure. So just extending or returning to the Van Gogh theme, in the last 6 or 7 years of Mitchell's life, she experienced periods of illness. She was being treated for cancer. She started having difficulty with mobility. But she really continued to push herself, to take risks, and to allow herself even to contradict herself in a way, and to go return to Van Gogh and Cézanne and really reckon with them in a way that she hadn't. She made several paintings that take on Van Gogh and Cézanne in very direct ways, kind of painting her way through their work and making it her own. We could go to the next slide. She returns to sunflowers as a motif and a source of feeling in a very big way in this period. These are pictures of sunflowers growing in her garden as well as drying in her studio from the 1980s. She talked in letters about loving sunflowers and across their entire life cycle, from their early bloom to when they're in all their glory, to their heads drooping and then turning brown and dying. And she also talked in letters about identifying with the life cycle of the sunflower, I think recognizing that her own time was short. And she made some of the most exquisite and nearly representational paintings of her life right at the very end of her life, really taking the sunflower and making it the center of the work. So this is one of the very last paintings that she made, 1992, untitled, and it kind of crystallizes so much of what her whole endeavor was about. It's about feeling, it's about a particular landscape, it's about connections to 19th century French painting, and it all comes together and kind of culminates with the very last works that she created. So should we stop there and open it up for questions? I see there's a few popping up in the Q&A.
Thanks everyone for sticking with us. Someone's asking about the titles, and did she come up with them first or afterwards? And
afterwards.
Yes. And often with other friends, like a parlor game. Like, let's have a few drinks and think of funny titles. And it's something, she always loved wordplay. She often got stuck with language and boring interviews and the blah, blah, blah of art critics and people like Sarah and myself, but she liked to play with words.
And the titles are an interesting kind of question throughout her body of work, because she often played them off as if they were meaningless, but they also connect very specifically to certain people, to her favorite dogs, to poems that she was reading, to musical compositions. So clearly she's making direct references with the title, even if she didn't really want to talk about it.
I just want to jump in and say thank you both so much for the presentation, and we will take questions now. I don't know if you want to just keep going with the Q&A, but I'm happy to read them if you prefer.
I'm just everyone's being so generous, and there's so many good questions. We probably can't hit all of them, so so I want to maybe hit the ones that are maybe some of the broadest. Somebody. Oh, now there's a chat. There's a chat, and
it gets confusing.
You're chatty bunch. And so, what was the biggest? That's a good question. What was the biggest surprise we discovered in our research about Mitchell and her work? I'm curious, Sarah. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Surprise. Oh, I don't know. Can I punt on that one? I'll think about it for a minute.
I'm going to answer it. I'm going to say that
you go for it.
Sarah and I saw paintings one painting at a time for the most part, 600 paintings, one painting at a time. So the biggest surprise to me was to walk into the exhibition and the first, the glorious installation in San Francisco, and to be so amazed when you saw them together. She's even better than I realized. Even one painting at a time, you cannot tell how important she is until you get like the 70 best paintings all together in a room, 70 of the best. There are a lot of strong work. So that was an incredible revelation in a really dumb way.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And the way that they talk to each other and the things that you learn from one painting by what it's hung next to was dramatic. And we moved things around a little bit in our, from our initial floor plan, just because we liked the juxtapositions. And there's one group of works that you hung together, Katy, in Baltimore, that were in different locations in San Francisco. And when I walked in, and we talked about it when I walked in and saw your installation, it was just sort of a revelation to me how closely related they were. And they really hadn't been in my mind. So yes, what you learn when you put works next to each other, I think, is always fantastic, but particularly rich with Mitchell.
Yeah, and so I hope everyone can come to Baltimore and then to Paris, because the more you can see them in different relationships, the better. There are a lot of people with wonderful stories, people who knew Joan or had some kind of connection. So we're extra grateful that that you could come and share those thoughts with me. I hope we can save those. I'm just trying to think if there's her love of Sancerre.
There's a lot of questions about like the juxtaposition between some of the small works and the works on paper and the correlation between those. This is kind of an interesting question. If any of those translate, as like she did a sketch and then made a painting from it, or just even seeing those small canvases is kind of a surprise to.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that was a bit of a surprise to us too, is the more we looked at the small works, the more you come to see that they're not studies, they're not warm-ups, they're not, her way of getting loose or any of that. They are fully considered deeply impactful works on a smaller scale. And so we really wanted to include them to show that she had this capacity to move between bigger works and smaller works, which is quite difficult to do, for any kind of painter. But I think particularly for abstract painters, she had an amazing facility with that. And she talked about the small paintings as important to her. So we really wanted them to be interwoven into the exhibition, because I also think you learn about what's going on in the big painting by seeing what's happening in the related small painting that's right next to it.
And I think that was one of the revelations too, or one of the things we saw is the expanded possibilities of being a woman at the time, that you could be incredibly ambitious and make these enormous paintings, but that you could also value things that were small in a way that her ego didn't get in the way, according to her therapist, and that she valued the small moments, like a little poem, a little flower, but also little painting could feel to her as if they were scaled up the way big paintings were. There are a couple of people asking about how she handled those big canvases and the triptychs and diptychs. How did she approach them? One, she didn't have an assistant. She had people who helped her clean brushes or, do things like that around the studio, but she was alone. So there are a lot of amazing photos of her moving the panels around. And so I think even after she had room for she could have painted in bigger single canvases. She liked the panels partly because it kept her in control. And it let her handle the work herself and the compositions.
But also, quite interestingly, her studio was much bigger in Vitoy, but it still wasn't big enough for her to set up those big triptychs, 3 next to each other. She could only ever have 2 of the 3 panels at a time directly next to each other to be actively worked on or considered. So that's a pretty fascinating element of her process as well, is that the 3rd panel, or in some cases the 4th or 5th panel, would be off to the side and not really visible as she was painting. She was painting them almost as individuals and then putting them together and kind of knitting them together quite late in the process. So holding that element of, holding an element in memory and painting to that with what she had on the panel in front of her is to me, a deeply interesting part of how she's making these multi-panel paintings.
And I think it goes to a question that Robin Olson is asking about when the diptychs and triptychs often don't connect, and what's the relationship between them. So sometimes there are strokes that go across the panels connecting them, and sometimes there are parallel marks so that they reflect each other. A lot of different carefully thought out relationships.
And she also, we know in some cases, started a triptych and then took the middle panel out and made it a diptych and used the center panel as a solo, an individual panel. The painting that we have in San Francisco that's called Bracket started as a diptych and was pretty far along. And then she decided to add a center panel, pulled the 2 sides apart, put one in the middle, and that's why it's called Bracket, because the 2, the original panels bracket the center one. So they weren't necessarily fixed in her head as a composition until right at the end. And we know that she reordered things and as she was finishing them. I'm seeing about Vitoy and the studio there and whether we went to visit, which we did, but it's a privately owned property and we weren't able to gain access. So we kind of peeked over the fence and we walked all around the neighborhood and up and around and behind and in every angle we could, just to get a sense of the place and a sense of the landscape. It's a beautiful village. If you're ever in Paris, it's worth taking the 45-minute drive out to Vitoy. And there's a kind of postcard little town square that has a really goofy mural of all the famous artists who have lived and worked in Vitoy, including Mitchell and Monet and Riopel.
Can you speak to her process at all in terms of like how long she would spend on a painting? Because as someone's pointing out, they're very energetic and seemingly very spontaneous and fast. That's not necessarily the case.
It's such a smart question. I saw that, Sam, in the chat, because it's saying those are the 2 sides of her that she's talking about from the very, I'll let Sarah speak to her process, but just say that is so perceptive, that she was, on the one hand, accurate was the word she used. She valued accuracy in someone like de Kooning, who every mark was intentional, However, whatever the rhetoric around ABEX is of spontaneity and improvisation, much like the jazz musicians themselves, you know, very intentional. And then on the other hand, from accuracy is intensity, which is the thing that she saw and valued in Van Gogh. You know, so structure, deliberation on the one hand, and then strong emotion and intuition, and direct action on the other.
So in terms of how long it would take her to make a painting, I think it varied widely. I mean, I think there are instances of, you know, paintings being completed over a period of a few days. More commonly, I think it was a few weeks or a few months. There are, I can think of at least one painting that we know she went back to after a year. So it was, you know, not you know, all in one shot, all in one night kind of process at all. And as Katy said, she really valued deliberation, and she also spent a lot of time looking. I think looking was as important to making the painting as actually putting the mark down. So people who spent you know, kind of knew her and had talked to her about her studio practices. The studio was very long and narrow, and she would paint on the front wall, and then she would go all the way back. She had not great eyesight at all, and she would get as far back as she could, and spend time just looking and choosing and thinking about where the next mark could go. So a slow and very considered choice, even though the marks themselves convey speed and spontaneity.
Mm-hmm. Sam, I'm going to let you call time when you've had enough of us. So
I feel like we're going to get a million questions to keep coming in. So maybe we should just work to wrap it up. Do
you want to pick another question or two from the Q&A, Sam?
Yeah, sure. Someone is wondering when the show opens in Paris.
October 2023. And it has a long run, so lots of time to make a trip if you can swing it.
This is what was her let me see. Someone's asking about her relationship to other, you spoke to this some, but some of the other female painters of her generation, like those close painters like Elaine de Kooning or some of that generation.
They were, I mean, it's a sad, like, that's why we wanted to move away from this story, which is so well told. They were competitive. It's a little crabs in a barrel, you know, on the surface. There were quotas at the galleries, one woman only. Frankenthaler was the girlfriend of Clement Greenberg, and Mitchell felt like they were against her. Grace Hartigan was very competitive and wrote very critical things in her diary. So it's also it's not anything to do. It's not really much to do with the paintings, because she's really looking at de Kooning, Klein, and Gorky, you know, and the gender is not reflecting on the work. You know, it's about the social relationships, and those are really screwed up by the sexism of the moment, as opposed to the 70s. Yep.
I'm also seeing a lot of questions about paint and the kind of paint that she used, and that's one of the kind of big questions I think that we would still love to dig into, is some scientific analysis of the French paint versus the paint that she sourced in the United States, which was quite different. And she wrote in a number of letters when she first got to Paris about how she didn't know how to work with the French paints because the blues were different, the reds were different, the viscosity was different, all of it was different. But the names and colors were different, exactly. So she was a Lefebvre Foinet fan in Paris and really bought her paint almost exclusively from them. I think people gave her samples of other things, and in her studio when she passed, there were lots of different brands, but that was her first love among the French paints. And I do think you can see the difference in the works where there's a mix, but we're sort of dying to have some scientific analysis help sort out what's what.
To be continued, for sure.
Yes.
Did she ever use Williamsburg paints, which were?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can see there's a lot visibly as you're walking through the show when that moment happens. The colors are completely different.
Yes. And people allude to her dealings with, her personality and dealing with dealers and stuff. But I think the thing that made her angriest is when people would change their paint formulas and she would be frustrated by the paint quality. So there's quite a bit of that in the book and in the archives.
This is a question, did she ever mention Japanese art? For this viewer, her work is reminding her of Japanese screens.
Yeah, it doesn't mean it's wrong, but she never talked about it. It's really France for her, not Germany. It's really France.
Well,
oh, and she loves dogs. Since my dog keeps barking in the background.
There's always a dog on Zoom. Well, I mean, I'm really excited about the catalog. So I just, I hope everybody can go see the show in Baltimore or in Paris, or if you've already seen it in San Francisco. And the catalog is really excellent and beautiful. A lot of work I've never seen before. And I wonder if you might just speak to a little further to, her taking on those French ghosts when she's in Paris, Cézanne's and Van Gogh and Monet. Like, it really seems like she powers it. She leans into that later on in life, as opposed to being overshadowed by it, which I think is really courageous in a way.
Yeah, it's a really risky move to make, as a painter who's been painting for decades and talked about those influences and that deep interest that she had, and she knew the work, she studied the work, but then to turn in the late 1980s and make a painting called No Birds that is directly thinking through the Van Gogh Wheat Field with Crows, and a group of works that similarly is addressing directly Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire series, is extraordinary. I mean, to kind of take those ideas, to take those compositions, to take the paint colors and the marks and make them her own is really brave and quite successful. I think those works are fantastic.
I think after decades where everyone was very involved in art about art and what Clement Greenberg thought or what Rosalind Krauss thought or whatever, we're really beginning to celebrate artists like Joan Mitchell, like Isamu Noguchi, like Jack Whitten, who had a much more expansive view of history. Whatever it was that they were into, they're looking at centuries, they're looking at big ideas and big feelings, and not this narrow little professionalized discourse of art about art. And I think that's incredibly exciting and rewarding.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been incredibly insightful and rewarding for all of us. So we really appreciate it. And I just, like I said before, I hope everyone can go see the work in person.
Yes, go to Baltimore.
The work is.
And thank you
for all the questions. I wish we could answer them all. It's been fascinating to watch the chat fly by, and Q&A. It's impossible to get to all of them, but really appreciate people taking the time.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, audience, and have a wonderful night. Good night.
Bye, Sam. Thanks.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.